Today, we have a very special guest who brings a rare combination of corporate experience and innovative perspective on business challenge. Thomas Wittig was a global director at Microsoft and senior vice president at SAP. Today, he works as a consultant and coach, applying a systemic approach and business constellations to help organizations see beyond the obvious and solve challenges strategically. Thomas, welcome and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thomas, I have so many questions that I'm interested to hear, but having worked at Microsoft and SAP and large organizations, I was curious to know what led you to this work of systemic and business constellations, which is something very powerful, but not many people know about it or are a bit skeptical about it. And considering your background, I'm very curious to know what led you to this path.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. That's indeed quite some time ago. So yes, I spent some time in corporate enterprises, and since about a little bit more than 10 years, I have my own company. How it all started is probably going back, I would say 25 years or so, plus or minus. And I was a young manager at Microsoft with growing responsibilities. And I noticed that things got a little bit more complex. And there were certain symptoms, or now we would also say dynamics, evolving, both from a very quantitative perspective. So let's say, for example, if you manage exponential growth, like Microsoft did several times with products and platforms or the organization, that brings certain challenges on the quantitative side, but also on the, I would say, the inner movement of the organization and the people who are in the organization, especially young leaders. Okay. And about that time, I tried to discover new ways and methods. At that time, I would probably call myself the method man, and always trying to find new ways to do something better the next day, etc. And I stumbled into two interesting fields, which then later on turned out to be very useful, very fruitful for my work. One was the field of system dynamics modeling, which was spearheaded many decades before me by a gentleman named J. Wright Forrester at MIT. And he went into establishing a formal framework or method about describing and modeling complex systems so that we understand quantitative change over time. For example, movements like oscillation, exponential growth, overshoot and collapse. And these things are based
Proper
on
performance.
feedback structures, right? And that's, I would say, that's a necessary but not sufficient field to dive into. The other one was more concerning about the own inner movement, the development of relationships and people in organizations. And I coincidentally, quote unquote, stumbled into a training of family constellations. I had no idea what that was. I soon realized I have a massive blind spot. And as always, I wanted to know everything about that. But it took me quite some time to get there, if you want. So I attended many trainings, not intentionally thinking about that one day I would even use this in my own work, let alone teach it to other people.
Yes.
And so that's why I think these three pillars came together. The corporate experience. I still work in high tech. I work with a lot of growth-oriented companies today, but I'm also folding in the quantitative side. So from system dynamics, I do that a lot. And also, constellation work, if you want, or systemic approaches, which are more based on a relationship level.
Yes, that's great. That's
a long story. It's very condensed, though. It's about 33 years explained in a couple of minutes, so to speak.
No, absolutely. Follow up next, because I heard one podcast of yours where you talk about a sick organization? What makes a healthy and sick organization, right? And much is talked about mental health, well-being on the people's perspective, right?
Mhm.
But we don't hear much about this within the organization context, as a thinking of the companies as living organisms, right?
Yes.
So what I wanted you is what I want is to take this opportunity to first introduce the concept of systemic
Mhm.
constellations within the business context,
Mhm.
né? How this fits within the healing and organization.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a wide topic. So let me put it this way. We often observe in organization that things don't go the way we have planned it. And that's not because of external influence factors like the market or regulations or prices or climate or whatever. There is a certain inherent dynamic in organization which makes it difficult for an organization, for example, to renew itself. No? When we talk about renewal in the context of organization, we talk about innovation management or a portfolio of products or strategic options that we have. Okay. So I became interested in that. Why is that? And in that field, in that area, we are standing also on the shoulders of a giant. Bert Hellinger was the founder of a family constellation, and he discovered in his work with families and groups in a broader sense, or social systems, that there are certain systemic orders or laws that govern the relationships of people in this, as you said, the living organization or organism. So, for example, one of the orders that he discovered is the order of belonging, or the order of rank is another one, no? Or orders of the balance of giving and receiving. When this is out of balance, the organization becomes sick, often unknowingly. And often we perceive symptoms that somebody is freaking out in some area of the organization where we haven't really anticipated it. That's usually a symptom of a broader systemic issue. Okay. So, a very common example or very common case is that the systemic rank orders are not even understood, let alone observed, no? Or the organization is living by these systemic orders. What do we mean by that? One of the systemic order of rank is, for example, very simple, that those who were there first have a higher rank. Okay. So in the
So
family,
hierarchy,
a
right?
hierarchy if you want,
Mhm.
but I'm trying to go away from this hierarchical view that we have of the organization, no? But you could say it that way. For
Mm.
example, in the family, it's very clear. The Eltern were first, and then came the children. But before the parents, the elders, there were the grandparents. No? And
Mhm.
even with the children, there's a rank order of those siblings who came first have a higher rank order. They're not more important, but they have a high rank order from a systemic perspective. Now, back
Mhm.
to the organization, what often is that a new manager is coming into a group in a broader sense, and she or he says, okay, now I'm the boss, I'm number one. Again, if you apply the systemic view, you would say the manager is coming in last. So, from a systemic perspective, he or she has to start from the end of the queue, so to speak. No? But when somebody's assuming a place that is not in tune with the systemic orders of the organization, then the organization becomes sick. Okay, so we have to take a look at what are these orders and where do we have an injury, so to speak. No? Another
Mhm.
common
So
case is that people are excluded. That happens quite a lot in organizations, business, and enterprises. For example, former founders or victims sometimes, no, that the organization doesn't even want to look at that from a legal perspective or whatever, but from a systemic perspective, we have to include those that belong to the organization. Okay. I will put this in very
This is what I
simple
was going to
terms.
ask next, which is what are the metrics we can use to measure the well-being of an organization? Not just money or profits, right? There are other metrics.
Yeah, if you want to put it down to numbers, I would say what managers typically look for is, or what they perceive is, when clients and talents are running away or not joining the organization. That's typically a sign that something is not really where it should be. No? On the more, let's say, this softer side of systemic constellation, we really don't have key performance indicators or trend lines or something like that. What is more important is that the experience and the perception of the organization, you can really feel that. You come into a company, you come into a meeting room, you can almost sense it when there is like this thick air and there's kind of tension and conflict, etc.
Okay. And then if we consider, of course, within the business world, there are many challenge or difficult decisions that the company has to make. And this creates these conflicts or misaligned teams. What are the challenge, the specific challenge a company face that business constellations can help?
There are many areas. I have to say, going a little bit back to your first question, at the beginning, I basically explored these approaches or these frameworks, and I really couldn't see how they apply. But more and more, and now in today's work, I apply these concepts more in even very specific context of the enterprise or the organization. For example, client relationships, product management, branding. Yeah, sometimes the brand doesn't resonate and you try to figure out what is going on, why does it not work, or project management, even to financial flows. No, so there are many areas of applications, of course. Yeah. Sorry, I forget your question now. You need to repeat the
Yes,
question.
branding, project management,
Okay.
product and project, you would
Yeah.
say, because
Oh,
then it
yes.
makes the delivery of the product and the project within the groups.
Right.
Does it make
Yeah,
sense?
these are areas of application. But you asked me about something really interesting, which is decisions. Okay. I looked at this once in the context of a seminar, and typically what we do is we are dedicating ourselves to a certain topic to surface new systemic insights. No? And what surfaced over time was there are certain, let's say, very strategic decisions that leaders and managers are making in organizations. So maybe I can start there. So one decision, one key decision is, where are we now and where do we need to be? That's a strategic leadership question, because the leader needs to lead the organization to a place where the organization can thrive, where it can grow. So that's, in a sense, some people who are familiar with the work know that I typically say it's the movement towards life. No? What's in their back often is the hungry bear of the crisis going after them, and they know they have to move. So this very strategic decisions, where do we go, is a matter of the vision, the strategy, etc. Right? You cannot
And
outsource that.
that will depend on the maturity of the company,
Yeah.
at what is the type of decisions that they need to make, whether it's branding, whether it's pricing, whether
Right.
it's clients, products,
Yeah.
projects, correct?
We come to pricing in a moment, but I want to stay with these strategic decisions, right? Strategic means,
Yes.
from a systemic perspective, also, it's hard to revise. So once you go there, you cannot really go back. No? Another strategic decision is, who belongs to us now and in future. So unlike in families, an organization is trying to change its composition over time in order to increase the chances of success and survival. Okay. The leadership team typically is looking for where do we need to, for example, create jobs? What are the talents, the capabilities that we need to develop or acquire? It's also a fairly strategic decision. No? There are several others, but I think these are important. One area that I work a lot on is innovation. So you also need to make sure, we need to make a decision where to innovate and what are the old things that need to be sunsetted, for example. No? Yeah. So
Absolutely,
that's the
absolutely.
strategic level. No? Pricing is also an important decision, but I would say you can play around with pricing quite a little bit to figure out what is the pricing that resonates. No? Pricing plays an important role in the exchange process. No? As I mentioned, exchange, giving and taking is an important systemic order, and price serves in this exchange. So that's why
Yes.
price plays a very important systemic role.
Absolutely. And what I want to, the focus that I want to stay more at is around the leadership. And the reason
Yeah.
why is because I want to go into a topic that is, people are talking about a lot, which is mental health.
Yeah.
We know that mental health has been a concern globally
Mhm.
for many years already. And now in Brazil, the government, they recently introduced a regulation which basically requires organizations of any size to, let's say, be responsible to follow certain criteria or standards about the employee's mental health, or they will be fined,
Mhm.
basically.
Mhm.
And based on that, I have a few questions around the leadership decisions,
Mhm.
because how do you see business constellations supporting an organization to build a culture that supports mental health? Because I think that has to come from the organization culture
Yeah.
and not so much to comply with the rules, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Sanctioning a new legislation doesn't make any organization healthy or worse, right? As you said,
Mm-hmm.
it comes down to the culture. Now, what is culture? Culture is what we really do on a day-to-day basis. For example, how business gets done, how meetings get
Mm-hmm.
conducted, how we communicate with each other, how we run
Mm-hmm.
projects, how we work with clients. That's part of the culture. Culture is not what we see in the law, and culture is also not often not what we see on the poster on the wall where it says we thrive for excellence, teamwork, and whatnot. You can forget about that's not culture. That's I don't know what it is. Usually it's bullshit, yeah, to be honest. And
It's
we,
just to show
yeah,
to people, right?
no? But people in the organization perceive the culture. No? And so it's really important to go down into this experience level for the leaders in the organization to figure out how do we create a place where a certain way of dealing with each other and our external partners can thrive. That's what we call culture. No?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I found, this is a little bit of a side note. Last year, I did a little study and I published a tool called the Systemic Leadership Quiz. And it's a very short quiz, like 5 minutes or so. And people answer a couple of questions. And I wanted to see how people perceive themselves and versus are they really capable of answering questions or assessing situations, no?
Mm-hmm.
And the results were quite astonishing. I'm sometimes talking about that in seminars and webinars, no? But it's really flipping upside down. People think of themselves as very knowledgeable about both relationship issues and quantitative things. But then when they have to put this into practice, they become very surprised. They said, "Oh, I didn't realize that." So it's 80-20 rule, right? 80% people think
Mm-hmm.
they're really competent. And then at the end of the quiz, they realize their competency score is 20%. No? It's not to make people feel bad about themselves, but to surface certain insight. No? Where do we have blind spots? and where do we need to work as teams and leaders. That's where I think this law needs to be turned into practice, both in Brazil, in Europe, and other geographies.
Yes, I think especially because there is this debate whether people really care, the companies really care, or whether they are just trying to do something to comply. And this is where it gets a bit tense.
Yeah.
And I think this is where I think there is a fine line between mental health potentially caused by the organization
Yeah.
due to stress and burnout, toxic environment, harassment, all that we know the root cause to be the company, let's say, because of the environment, or mental health caused by personal issues that the person is facing outside of work, health problems, parenting, relationship issues, marriage, and so on.
Yeah.
So I think that the debate is, why should companies be responsible for that level of employees' health? And I think I wanted to ask you, considering the systemic principles, at what extent should the companies be responsible or get involved in this? And how can this be communicated effectively?
So I want to put it this way upfront, right? If you take this serious, this can become a competitive advantage, your magic superpower. Okay. And I will first explain another example, which we're also facing right now, which is the privacy management. I'm working a lot digital marketing and digital strategies. And in 2018-19, the European Union sanctioned the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, which was then trickled down into the countries. Brazil followed with the LGBT, and it's very similar. Now, and people said, we have to do this, and yeah, let's cover it, etc. But then some companies figured out, okay, we can turn this around. And they started, and that's what I worked also with, the privacy-led approach, okay? If you take this serious and you discover the possibilities for your clients and your organization, that is very interesting, and that opens new opportunities. Now, back to the topic of mental health in organization, you could say, okay, my attitude as a business owner company is to say, okay, compliance, I have to do things right, and then I'm finished. So covering our bases, and then we're done. But my sense is that those companies who tackle this from a competitive advantage perspective are automatically creating a more effective workplace, a more attractive workplace, which attracts more talents and also more customers. We know that if somebody in customer service has a bad day, it immediately reflects on your customer satisfaction scores, like your NPS score or your satisfaction scores, whatever you are using. It's all connected. Customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, mental health, all the way to the family well-being. Okay, so that's where I think we need to have another mindset and turn this into a competitive advantage.
Yes, I think this is what I want to the message to pass on to people. It's not just about the rules, it's also the benefits. Not the message is, it's not about the cost. It's about the benefits, the innovation, the creativity, the productivity that the business owners will get from investing in the employees' well-being, right? If they change their perspective, maybe they can see that they will be benefited.
Absolutely. It's a matter of cost. So it's a cost side, but also revenue side. There's a lot of upside. You could say, okay, a healthy organization, we know this from statistics. You just need to look into the numbers. There's a growing trend of absenteeism in organization, often driven by stress or other mental issues. That's a known fact. We have a lot of data about that. Is costing organizations, both private and public sector, a lot of money and capacity. The problem is also when you have 10% of your workforce or 20% of your workforce sick or unproductive, Then the other 80% need to work harder to compensate for that, right? So you're paying a very high price on several fronts, no? On the other side, the upside, where we talk about the revenue or profitability or productivity, a healthy organization can accomplish more, can move faster, yeah? And that's where I think we are often mistaken, where we say, yeah, okay, yet another program, we have to comply. How much does it cost? This one shall pass too. Okay, let's roll out another poster on the wall and say, we are a healthy organization. Huh? And then you look into the numbers and you realize people are running for the hills, right? Or they're getting sick on Monday morning when they wake up and go to work.
Yes. And when we say also systemic constellations, we understand that within the organizations, it can overlap between the personal and professional matters. Because we know that sometimes the matter is professional, sometimes it's personal, and maybe they are linked. And that's why it seems that the root cause is within the company, but maybe something else from the past is triggering certain reactions within the business concept. So what would you say, how does this connection impact the company's performance, and how can companies tackle that?
So you're referring specifically to private topics versus company topics?
Yeah, I guess what I want to get to is how companies ultimately teaching people the benefits of the systemic constellations within the business concept, within maybe some people might benefit from the systemic constellations work personally to work out things that they can be projecting in the company. So this is what I wanted to ultimately get.
Okay. So let's unpack this a little bit, right? So there are at least two aspects to this. One is, I would say, when it's this other way or new way of working is taking an impact and it makes a difference, then people are more likely to adopt it. No? When they say, hey, I did this, I'm practicing this now in a different way, and it helps me to, for example, communicate better. We have better relationships between departments, for example, no? Or between managers and employees, or managers are also often employees, but let's say leaders and followers, or between customers, suppliers, partners, and so on, whatever you do. No? So only if there's an impact, a perceivable impact, that it's facilitating. Yeah, facilitation from the old Latin word means to make it easier, not more difficult, but easier. No? That's what we are looking for.
Also, I guess if we can put this into more simple or more real case, I'm saying also cases where people can grow and progress in their role if they work on some of the issues or challenge or lack of confidence. Even, for example, public speaking. Someone is really good at what they do and they deliver very good work, but if they are to take a more senior role, they will have to work on the soft skills of public speaking. Or this is what I'm saying. I think there is this benefit of developing people, and then they can serve the company better too.
Yeah, you're right. So along those lines, the second topic was, how do you get started? No? We often hear about systemic constellation. This sounds like a really big thing, but we have to make it really simple for people. And sometimes in my work, I start very simple. No? And I ask people, okay, who has been here for the longest time? Yeah. And somebody raises the hand and people start looking, said, oh yeah, that person, I didn't realize that. No, he's been here 32 years. No. Yesterday I talked to a very dear colleague who spent 38 years at one company. No? She is definitely very knowledgeable. She has a very high systemic rank. No? So I ask that question, and then I ask, who's new? No? And then I put that person on the other side of the room, and everybody builds a lineup. What often happens is that people start to giggle. They start to laugh and giggle because they suddenly discover a systemic order. They experience a systemic order, and they realize, I had no idea they were here so long. Of course, the people who are really long in an organization, they see the young people, no? But they also want to be seen by the young people in their respective systemic rank. No? That's an easy way to get started, and then I'm explaining a little bit about that, etc. It doesn't have to be complicated. No? Now, this is helping to surface and experience systemic orders. I'm a big fan of experiential learning. Okay, that means that we make a personal experience, and that is something that we can anchor here, not in the head and not writing on paper. Yeah, people run around with sticky notes. But if you have it here, you can reactivate it in the context when the situation arises. Talking about communication, I just make a very specific example, okay? And that is about communicating change. What often happens is an organization needs to go through a change. The leaders announce it, more or less effective, most of the time ineffective. But that's not what I want to talk about. And change happens somehow, and sometimes it's a mess. Yeah, people then don't know. Okay, is it over, or am I endangered tomorrow? What's happening now? No? What often leaders forget is to say, "This was the change. We are here now. Now it's over. This is how it is now." Just exactly how I said this. This is over. This is how it is now. And then people can say, okay, so now from here, where do we go? Instead, what happens, the leaders forget about that. And they think, okay, I know it's over. And they think everybody else knows too. But that keeps the organization in a permanent stress. And that's one of the reasons which also makes organizations sick. You know? This perma-stress. Some evil leaders use that as a weapon to keep people on the toes. That creates a very toxic environment. Right? There's no organization that will survive that in the long run. No.
Yes, yes. We'll go now into the skepticism of people and leaders in this practice, especially you worked in large organizations, and you know that some industries, it's just their nature. It's fast-paced environment.
Yeah.
The whole industry is designed to be stressful, is designed to be crazy. So it's very hard to sometimes implement certain practices, their minds to business leaders and senior people.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Towards the constellations, yes.
If you want to move fast, then people need to have a common understanding, right? And you need to, so to speak, sing from the same song sheet, no? To create an orchestra. And that is often not happening. No? One group is moving very fast and they leave everybody else behind. No? I get it. I work with a lot of fast moving organizations. Actually, when I'm doing a lot of digital marketing, you have to stay on top of this beast every single day because Google, Microsoft, Amazon, LinkedIn, they come up with great new stuff every day. No normal human being can keep up with that on a day-to-day basis. It drives people crazy, right? So we need to acknowledge that we're living in this very fast-paced world. It doesn't get easier, I would say, even though we have new forms of AI enablement. But you also need to keep up with that. No? Very difficult to keep up with the AI developments, even if you watch the news every day. No?
Yes.
I think it's a time well spent and invested to work not only on the technocratic side of the equation, but on the relationship side of the equation in every aspect. Even when we're designing a new product, when we are running a campaigns, no? For example, it's very important to understand and put on a different hat and say, okay, if we look at something that's not working, if we take a look at it from a systemic perspective, what could possibly be wrong? Yeah. Where is something not, quote unquote, in order? And that brings sometimes new insights, no?
Mhm. You know what is interesting? I watched a documentary about Google the other day,
Mm,
and they were telling about the journey. And one of the products, which is the Google Plus, a few years back,
yeah.
they were sharing on the documentary, and I wanted to get your perspective on that. The Google Plus didn't work out because basically they failed to look at what the clients wanted.
Mm,
All they were looking at was to compete with Facebook.
yeah.
They were more interested in staying competitive
Mm,
with Facebook than looking at the client's needs. What do they really want?
yeah.
And they were sharing that failed.
Yeah.
I think these are some of the dynamics that happen in real life. The intrinsic motives, intrinsic motivations of the
Yeah.
company sometimes is not to serve the clients, but to just money or just to compete or
Mhm.
to maybe a bit of ego sometimes to stay in the market and have a certain position. Then they fail to deliver value. I don't know,
Yeah.
to see what the clients. What are your thoughts on that?
You bring up an interesting example. No? Google Plus didn't really survive that long. It came out. Some people thought, okay, we might use it because we have already Google accounts, but turns out nobody really was using it. No? Generally, in technology adoption, there's this very powerful concept of positive feedback loop, no? Or word of mouth. The more people use a certain product or tool, the more people will use it. No? For example, you mentioned Facebook, Insta, TikTok applies certainly to a lot of social media. That's a phenomenon. No? And that can only work because basically of a number of things. You need to have some early adopters. The product needs to be very sticky, yeah, so that people say, okay, I want that. I want exactly this because we need to have it because the Jonesons have it too, or the children are on that. No, we need to be on that platform too. No? And it needs to be very infectious, no? So that once you see it, you want to have that. Google Plus apparently wasn't really in that category. And you mentioned something that I would say one view is the view on the customer, and that would basically say, what does the customer want that we could provide? You said something very interesting when you look at the competition to the other side and say, what do the other guys do that we should also do? You're not having customer, you're not focusing on the customer, you have competitor focus. No? There's nothing wrong with competing, but the successful companies will try to find something they could do better to better satisfy the requirements and intrinsic needs and motivations of their clients. That is customer focus. Customer focus is not trying to be better at the other guys. No?
Absolutely. Do you have other case studies around how the constellations work was like impacted the leadership or helped the communication, the organization culture?
Yeah, there are many examples, no? Both from people who attend the training seminars, they come back, they talk about it. I like to weave in some form of what I call the peer review. Some people ask me if I do supervision. I really hate that word now because supervision means that you are taller than the other. That's already a violation of systemic orders. Instead, what I like to do between webinars and seminars, people practice some stuff, they test it out. Or when I'm mentoring somebody, I say, hey, do this, no? And let me know next time how it works. No? And you get a lot of really interesting feedback. No? I want to give you two cases. No? Once I worked with middle or top manager, VP kind of person, and he was sent into this mentoring thing with me because his superior he thought that he needs to work on communication. Of course, he came and said, my boss sent me here. She said I should work on communication, but I don't see anything that's wrong with my communication. So we don't know what we don't know. No, that's typically a starting point. Anyway,
Blind spots.
anyways, long story short, I basically worked with him and tried to figure out how he's typically working. And then I turned that around. Typically, what he would say is, I would first try to explain why we need to do a certain thing, and then I make a recommendation. And then I say, okay, you have lost already your audience at the beginning. So try to make that the other way around. He did that, and he had great results. His manager said, I don't know exactly what you do, but your communication is definitely much better. And that's sufficient. That's all we need. Another interesting thing is I had a case. I was working with a company, and this is actually a real case study I have written about on one of my websites. And we were looking into the topic of talent acquisition and recruitment marketing, which is a big topic in a lot of markets. Companies struggling with that. And I was talking with a colleague, and I said, hey, working with the clients here, and we were trying to run even awareness seminar, but not a lot of people showed up. And I said, that's like really strange, because everybody's complaining about this skilled labor shortage. It's very common in Germany or other European countries, probably in Brazil also. And she said, yeah, for me, it's very clear. She said, they don't want to go to find the talents. They expect that the talents come to them. I said, I don't believe that, because they're so desperate. And then I said, okay, how could we do this? And then what I did is I ran a little test advertisement campaign. And it's what's called an A/B test. So you have two variants, A and B. The first had the headline, for example, find new employees. Okay. And the other variant was employees find you. And what was astonishing is that on employees find you, a lot more people clicked on that advertisement. So that's a very practical example how you can use systemic insights to inform your decisions, your communications, your product design, etc. It's very practical.
Fantastic. Okay, I know that we are coming to the time, but I wanted to ask you, what would be the protocol you would recommend to assess the health of an organization, if any, or if you have any exercises to share, something that people can get a feel for this work?
There are many different ways, and I would say you need to be specific to the situation, the particular situation of the organization and the members of the organization. Okay. So I wouldn't say there's one general formula, but
what a few things that we can talk about here is the different levels, right? So for example, from belonging perspective, we have the situation with the founders, with the investors. From the rank or hierarchy perspective, then we have the teams, how that is organized, and then from the balance between give and receive, we have the way how the shares and the salaries and the bonuses are paid. So I think this is maybe, could you say that these are could be the starting point for an assessment in terms of things to look for?
You could do it this way, okay? That's of course, but you have already a bouquet of topics, no? What I
is my mind, the way how my mind works.
Yeah, so you could pick any one of these topics, no? I start usually very simple in this way of working with an organization, and it's a focus on the challenge of what's wrong. No, it's a problem focus, so to speak. But I ask not what's your problem, but I would ask with, for example, what's the issue, and just ask a few more questions to surface and narrow down what's the most important issue at this point in time. It may be an ownership issue, it may be a governance issue, it may be a product pricing, customer service, whatever it is, but you need to start somewhere, right? So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing is, what I discovered is that it's also a certain maturing process until you acquire a certain level of systemic awareness or leadership capabilities. And the first step is to become aware and start experience what are these inherent movements and orders. No? That's the awareness level. The next might be an application level where you say, okay, that sounds interesting. How do I apply this in a specific context? Or, for example, in communications or working with each other or change management. No? And then all the way it can progress up to a point where you say, okay, now we're looking for a way to integrate that more into who we are as an organization. No? So it's the integration from a leadership perspective. But you don't start on top. That was the mistake I made when in 2000, and to close the circle here a little bit, closing the loop, so to say, first time I went to such a seminar, I said, whoa, this is powerful. How can I integrate this in my practices? No? And I realized you have to work your way to that point. Yeah. So there's no shortcut. There's no detour. You have to work through this in a way to build up this experience. And that's why, again, I became this fan of experiential learning in many ways, both from this inner movement. And sometimes when I'm teaching courses at the university, I let students play with quantitative models, for example. It's a playful but experiential learning process. Much better than if you say, read this book, read the policy, read the law, and then we are a happy, healthy company. It's not happy.
Yes. No, that's very interesting because I think the same with us as a person. If we start looking for things, we can always find something.
Yeah.
But the question is that necessary? Is that useful to know everything that it could be wrong? No, let's go into the problem. If this is what's causing a problem, then you tackle that specifically, and then
typically the starting point is something that is not working or where there's a problem. Something is broken or doesn't work, and we try to make something good out of that, no? And trying to improve. You could say that's a reactive approach. A proactive approach would be to say, hey, knowing what we know, for example, knowing what we know from our first phase in our startup, how do we, startups say pivot, how do we pivot and create a more resilient, robust, and agile thing that people love? No? So that's a more proactive approach. No? But oftentimes, in order to get there, you often make this hard experience that something is breaking down. It's pay a price, but sometimes it's worth it.
Exactly. That's why I'm doing this podcast with you from the experience I had with you in May last year.
Yeah, it was.
In
I think you're
workshop.
referring to a very good seminar we had in São Paulo. I don't remember the title of the seminar, but it was something around systemic leadership advantage or so, which is exactly what we're talking here about. No? And that was great. Also for me, a big pleasure to work with the group of which you were part of.
Absolutely. It was very good. Now, I have one question to wrap up, which is nothing to do with business constellations, which is a bit more inspirational. So basically,
very good.
The inspiration for wellness therapies is to live the wow moments, the wow life. And I believe it comes a lot to our perspectives and the way how we see things. And I've been asking my past guests what was a wow moment in their lives within this concept of changing your perspective or connection, life? What was one moment in your life?
When we talk about this concept of systemic work or systemic insights, I would say probably the first encounter was really a big wow. I had goosebumps, no? And I said, oh, this is really interesting. And I realized I have so many blind spots in that space. How can I learn about this? That was really a big wow effect. Then there came
Yes,
several other wow effects after that, if I may mention a couple of those.
please.
The next one was certainly where I realized, wow, it's not something that you can immediately copy paste, so to speak. So you have to build some experience. So I went all the way and to learn and study about both quantitative and systemic work. So that was really an interesting segue into that. No? The other wow effects are really when you realize you see something in the seminars and you say, okay, what does it have to do with me? And then you realize the same thing happens also in your social fields, no? In the family, in the organization, in the family business, etc. No? It's not only the others, it also happens in our social fields in a broader sense. No?
Do you believe this has changed any area of your life personally?
Yeah,
Do
absolutely.
you, did you have that wow in your life after learning these concepts by changing your mind?
Yeah, completely. So I think that was really an enriching experience. I'm very thankful and grateful for the opportunities I had in my corporate and business career, no question about that. No, it was I had the luck to working with some amazing companies, and I would say the other two fields, no, system dynamics and the constellation work, are very enriching experience. The first thing that you realize is you look at the world differently. You're watching the news differently. You're reading the newspaper differently. No? It's not only what happens in our relationships, it's what's happening in the world right now, even with conflict. We do a lot of work on deep conflict. And boy, do we have a lot of deep conflict right now in this world at this point in time. No? You probably remember
Mhm.
some of the work that we did in the seminars. No? So that's a
Yes,
big eye opener. And as I mentioned before, it's also a grateful experience to stand on the shoulders of giants who have developed these fields before us. No?
yes, absolutely. Wow. That's fantastic,
Yeah,
Thomas. Thank you so much for your contribution, and I'm really excited to share this to more people. And hopefully, we can do a live session to people in Brazil, and especially now with the IN1, working with the culture, working with communication, improving leadership, and all these areas that is so important,
yeah,
especially now also with AI. More and more we have to start building
yeah,
this knowledge because this is how we are going to differentiate ourselves
yeah.
at the end of the day. So yes, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening to us. Anything that you like to say to wrap it up, Thomas?
As you say, I think, first of all, the best is yet to come, right? I think we have a lot of interesting opportunities ahead of that, but we also need to orient ourselves. So, for those of the listeners or viewers who want to experience more, they should get in touch. They should sign up for our ever growing waiting list and stay in
Exactly.
tune when we run the next experiences, both online but also in person. In person typically is a very rich, engaging experience, and I can only
Very
recommend
rich.
for people to get started. As you say, we haven't even touched AI. That's another big topic, which is forcing us to rethink who we are and what is part of our life and our contribution and our service moving forward. So, in that
Yes.
sense, I wish us all a big wow effect.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mm.